This week on Perspective, Russia's threat, Putin's global ambition. This week, Canada and its NATO allies and partners are delivering a forceful message to Russia and its president, Vladimir Putin. It comes in the form of a huge military exercise. 31 countries, 50,000 personnel, 250 aircraft, 65 ships, all in Russia's neighborhood, in the North Atlantic and Baltic Seas, in Norway and in nearby airspace. Russia has been invited to observe, to get the message of deterrence directly. Russia's belligerence is not new. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 sparked international condemnation and sanctions. There's ongoing conflict backed by Russia in eastern Ukraine, Russia's hand in the Syrian war, and there's fear of more Russian aggression. In Latvia, for example, where Canada leads a NATO battle group. But in Putin's campaign to make Russia great again, Western leaders also see a wider threat to international order and democratic institutions. The meddling in the U.S. election, for example, and social media campaigns of disinformation. This week on the program, we'll assess the Russian threat and what motivates Putin. We'll get a perspective from Moscow, and we'll also consider the threat to Canada. We begin with Tom Nichols, a professor at the U.S. Naval War College and the Harvard Extension School. He's a noted expert on Russia and the author, most recently, of the book, The Death of Expertise. How would you describe the threat posed by Russia now?
It's a different kind of threat than the old Soviet Union because the USSR had an ideology that it was trying to spread globally. And so we had to match the Soviet presence everywhere it appeared because we were playing a global game. The Russian threat is different. The Russian threat emanates from essentially a mafia state that has decided to operate by its own rules as a kind of anti-status quo power in the international system. But in the end, what the Russians are really about is keeping Vladimir Putin and his coterie and the industries that surround him in power and functioning. And that makes them dangerous in a different way. It makes them dangerous in the way a mafia family is rather than the way the old Communist Party was.
So if I take that analogy a little further, it's not just the violence, which we could equate on a national basis as a military threat. There are other tentacles to that threat. Describe them.
Well, for example, I think that the Putin regime, unlike the Soviet regime, is much more willing to reach out and commit acts of violence, not just against its own people at a very high level, but against Westerners. I mean, the idea of, the old Soviet Union taking out British citizens on British soil would have been almost unthinkable. Now, they did, the old Soviet Union used to engage in attacks against dissidents. That had gotten out, and they would try to take them out. But this is really, again, like a mob family putting out contracts at will on the territory of other states, as well as being willing to kill people like Boris Nemtsov, the very high-ranking Russian political opposition leader. You don't have the mass repression of the old Soviet Union that was largely facing internally, but you are facing them almost in a more dangerous way as the kind of gangsters that they're willing to be on other people's territories.
Do you think they affected the outcome of the U.S. presidential election?
That's hard to say. This is a good time to remind everybody that I don't speak for the U.S. government. Until recently, my answer has been that they had some kind of an impact, but that they didn't swing the election. I'm waiting to see. There's at least one new book coming out that claims to kind of amass the data that makes the case more likely that Russian propaganda could have swung those 60 or 70,000 votes. I think the bigger problem is that Western societies aren't prepared for the kind of information onslaught that the Russians have unleashed against the United States, against Canada, against Europe, and our allies. So in the end, I always blame the outcome of an election on the voters. But there's no doubt that the Russians attacked our institutions, and it may well be that they had more of an impact than even I'm perhaps willing to believe.
We're a year away from a federal election in Canada. How worried should Canadians be? What should they be aware of? Or are we small potatoes in, Putin's vegetable basket?
You're not small potatoes because, first of all, you're a major American ally. You're our sister country. You're a democracy in and of your own right, carrying on a foreign policy that the Russians don't happen to like. But also, the thing to remember about these Russian disinformation efforts is that they're not expensive. It doesn't cost the Russians a lot to invest in trying to screw up Canada's election. These are all very low-cost operations for the Russians, in part because they haven't had to pay a price for it. But it doesn't really cost Putin a lot to hire a lot of hackers and, fake Facebook accounts and things like that. So I think you ought to be worried, but I also think that the responsibility for defending against it has to rest with every member of your and our societies who say to themselves, look, I'm not going to get my information from RT or from Facebook or from, random websites, that I'm going to try and take in a balanced diet of information here and make better decisions. Because in the end, there will always be bad information out there. There is no way, and I think this is something that people in every democracy have to understand, there's no way to stop this.
What is Putin's goal then, beyond staying in power and being the godfather in a sense? What's his broader goal by doing that?
He doesn't really, I would say you could stop at staying in power and being the godfather. But I do think if you want to understand Putin, you have to understand that he's not a communist, he's not a Russian nationalist in that sense. He came up in the Soviet system. What he really misses is the days when the Soviet Union was a superpower. And that he misses the days of being a citizen of a state that is globally respected and powerful and a peer to the United States. The way I always put it is, if you really want to know what Vladimir Putin wants, he wants 1975 back. He wants the Soviet Union to be kind of astride the globe, the Americans, defeated in Vietnam, the American economy in shambles. The American political system, of course, was a hot mess in 1975 after Watergate. I think he looks back to those days and says, if I can create that kind of chaos again, that's a good day for me as a Russian leader.
So how is Trump helping him?
I think the problem is that the president's foreign policy and the rest of the government's foreign policy are on two different tracks. So, the president's defenders always say, well, look at the tough things we're doing with Russia. The problem is those are undermined when the president says, witch hunts, I can get along with Putin, everything's fine. I really thought that the Helsinki summit was terrifying. That what Putin took away from that is the rest of the American bureaucracy may be on one track, but I've got the President of the United States where I want him, and that I'm in charge of this relationship. So I think in that sense, Trump's foreign policy helps Putin in part because it keeps the American response wrong-footed and divided, but it also deprives NATO of essential leadership. I don't want to say the Americans are indispensable or fall back into that kind of language, but the United States is the leader of NATO. And right now, we've been abandoning that. And I think actually that goes back even to the Obama administration. We just have not exercised the kind of leadership and attention and commitment to NATO that we should. I mean, we helped to build that institution, and we need to be paying more attention to it.
So as citizens in a democracy, apart from sort of playing the role that you suggest and being more discerning in what we see as news and truth, what steps in to fill that vacuum? Who or what can step in to fill that vacuum? What's the counterattack, I guess?
I think of it not so much as a counterattack as inoculation. That you're not going to stamp out every moment of disinformation, because the Russians can manufacture this faster than they can light these fires faster than you can put them out. I think the important thing is to recommit. I think and I've made this argument in the United States. I've done some traveling among NATO countries in Europe where I've made this argument. We need to recommit to civic education and to civic involvement. and to programs like digital literacy and explaining how to read news sources. Very basic issues that I think we've left aside in the transition from the 20th to the 21st century. So I think we're in this for the long haul. You're not going to solve this problem in the next election. You're not going to solve it in the next 2 years. I think you're going to come under attack in your election. The United States is going to be under attack next month in November of 2018 and then again in 2020. We're not going to solve this overnight.
In the meantime, what do you worry about?
I worry that particularly where the Russians are concerned, that Putin feels so emboldened that he thinks that he is now living in a window where he can get away with everything he wants to get away with. That this is where he's going to try out his worst ideas, because he thinks that that at this point NATO is again on its back foot, that the Americans are divided. He's right on that. So
countries like Latvia are right to be very worried.
I think the Baltic states have every right to be very concerned, because I don't think Putin is a good strategist, and I might be a minority opinion on this. I think Putin's an excellent tactician. He's clever, and he's a very good mob boss. I don't think he's been a very good long-range strategic thinker, and the fact that Russia is in the pickle it's in with sanctions, bogged down in Ukraine, with NATO essentially recommitting to its own defense, even without prodding from the Americans, tells you that he's not good at the long game, and that may lead him to do something stupid.
I thank you very much for your expertise.
Thank you for having me.